Hello, and welcome to the recording of the class on Homer Among Thieves, International Cooperation of Authoritarian Regimes. I'm Alexander Libman, and I teach politics at the Institute for East European Studies of the Free University. Most of you who, at least those of you who specialize in politics in our institute, have already met me in one or several seminars. This brief introduction concerns probably one of two major topics political science deals with when studying Eastern Europe and more specifically post-Soviet Eurasia. In the 1990s, the research on post-Soviet countries kind of split in two major directions. One of them, and some of you who remember the introductory class of Orager and Reuter already know what I'm talking about, focused very much on subnational political variation, differences across individual Russian regions, different subnational regimes which emerge in these regions, and more importantly, the functioning of the political systems of post-Soviet countries, especially Russian authoritarianism. And another branch focused on international relations. And this branch of international relations also very much evolved in the shadow of authoritarian consolidation in Eurasia. And the outcome today is a broad and well-established scholarly tradition working on international cooperation of authoritarian regimes. And this is what I want to talk about in this class. You'll also see that this is a topic of immense political importance for European Union, for Germany, dealing with Eastern Europe, dealing with Eurasia, dealing with Russia, is in many cases implying solving questions about international cooperation of authoritarian regimes. I will not be able to respond to all of these questions, but at least I'm going to pose those, and it will give you a chance to discuss them and to think about them. All right, so let's start from the very beginning. You all remember 30 years ago, the end of history, Fukuyama, the end of the Cold War, and the expectation that now the global governance system will not be a compromise between authoritarian and democratic countries like it has been for the entire post-World War II era. This compromise is specifically present in the functioning of the United Nations, but rather determined by democratic countries. And at least in the 1990s, democracies are clearly designing the functioning of international system. They have the dominant role in international organizations, less in the UN, but more in structures like the IMF and the World Bank. They matter for resolving local conflicts. In Yugoslav wars, for example, democratic countries like the United States and the European Union are the dominant actors. And authoritarian countries, while certainly exist, seem to limit their attention to domestic processes, or at least to act very cautiously on international arena. China during this period does not exercise any substantial influence outside its borders, except focusing on economic development and prosperity. So, the end of history. Democracies determine the global governance. Early 2000s clearly showed us that it was not the case. At least since 2005, but probably even earlier, we see an increasing foreign policy activism of authoritarian regimes. And in this context, typically 5 countries are mentioned: China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia. In the Middle East, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia and Iran become key players actively interacting with other countries, with non-governmental organizations and movements, supporting those, engaging in local conflicts, sometimes acting as forces, reducing the confrontations, but very often increasing the intensity of those. China, over time, switches to the cautious and economically oriented approach towards more active foreign policy, and most clearly since early 2010s with what was originally called One Belt, One Road and is now called Belt and Road Initiative, China clearly makes a claim to designing the functioning of the global political and economic system. Venezuela under Chavez became a country openly questioning the liberal global order, promoting an alternative model, or at least claiming to promote an alternative model, and providing economic subsidies to countries which are willing to engage in more intensive cooperation with Venezuela, for example, within the framework of the Bolivarian Alliance for Our People in Latin America, the ALBA organization. And finally, Russia, over time, becomes more and more important internationally. And today, Russia is an actor which matters in many global conflicts. Think about Syria, Libya, Central Africa, and of course, post-Soviet Eurasia like Ukraine. So authoritarian countries become more important, and in the 2010s, a discussion starts about the emergence of alternative governance institutions and alternative globalization sometimes, with authoritarian countries becoming nuclei of entirely different way of governing international system. Especially China, with initiatives like the Belt and Road, with organizations like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, but also alliances like the BRICS, which is of course not clearly authoritarian, but where at least several key members like Russia and China are authoritarian countries, matter a lot in this respect, and there have been many ways of conceptualizing those. Calder, for example, has published an excellent book on new continentalism, where he claims that increasing economic connectivity in Eurasia, pipelines, roads, railroads, create something like a new political and economic reality, which will massively affect the way how global governance and regional governance functions. Today, you don't need to adhere to the rules which existed prior to this increasing activism of countries like Russia and China, if you want, for example, to receive money for developing your country, or if you want to find a way to integrate into the global economy. So there are now alternative ways of becoming part of the global economy than the traditional one adhering to the recommendations of the IMF and the World Bank. And Calder sees it as a problem. In his opinion, new continentalism challenges the existing economic order with unpredictable consequences. Others are much more optimistic, but I'll talk about that later. Alexander Cooley has a short article about what he calls the League of Authoritarian Gentlemen. And what he describes there is systematic cooperation of authoritarian regimes working together, supporting each other, promoting each other's goals, endorsing each other in, for example, pressuring the opposition or limiting freedom of expression and so on. And today, as of 2020 or 2021, think about the discussion about effective authoritarian responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Both domestic, the fact that, for example, China, the country where the pandemic started, at least claims to have eradicated it, but also international, the issue about use of vaccine produced by countries like Russia and China, and the acceptance of these vaccines, the usability of these vaccines for different countries, also has an important political dimension. And I guess in half a year from now, we'll see very interesting international discussions, for example, whether European countries will accept those who are vaccinated with the Russian vaccine as being protected from COVID-19 and, for example, allowed to enter the European Union. We don't know how it will develop and what will happen, but we'll have to wait and see. In any case, authoritarian countries are firmly back in international politics and they matter a lot. What I want to do in this recording, in this class, is to talk with you about a fundamental question which emerges in this situation. Are authoritarian regimes able to cooperate with each other in international affairs? Is there something like real League of Authoritarian Gentlemen with autocracies coming together and working together with each other? Or there are important limits for this cooperation? Under which conditions does cooperation of authoritarian regimes work? Or rather we see individual countries pursuing their own goals, struggling with each other, but never able to create something like an alternative project for governance and for international interaction. So I'm going to discuss this issue in this recording, and I'm going in particular to focus on two interrelated dimensions. The first one, we look at what I would call cooperation of authoritarian countries in substantive policies. That is, whether authoritarian countries are able to successfully work together in, for example, liberalizing international trade and creating different forms of international economic cooperation, like providing development assistance or ensuring cooperation in production and in commercial relations, or opening borders for economic migrants and so on. So the first question is really straightforward. We want to know whether actual, in particular, economic cooperation of authoritarian regimes is feasible. Another question, this will be the second part of today's discussion, will concentrate on interaction of authoritarian regimes in what is today very often called autocracy promotion and diffusion. Are authoritarian regimes able and willing to support each other in promoting authoritarianism worldwide? And under which conditions does this support work and how does it function? Before I, however, proceed to these topics, maybe a couple of remarks. Why do I discuss this issue here with you, of students of Eastern European studies? And the reason is that post-Soviet Eurasia is probably the most prominent, or at least one of the most prominent cases of research on authoritarian cooperation existing in the modern world. After the collapse of the USSR, multiple authoritarian regimes emerged in Eurasia. Some were established already in the early 90s, some consolidated in the 2000s. Most importantly, under Vladimir Putin, Russia clearly, without a doubt, became an authoritarian regime. There is some discussion about authoritarianism in the Yeltsin era, but under Putin, there is no discussion about that. And if you look at the modern Eurasia, you will actually, if we limit our attention to 12 former Soviet Union republics, except the Baltic countries, we'll find a handful of those which actually managed to create even fragile and unstable democracy. Moldova, Georgia, maybe Ukraine, maybe Kyrgyzstan, although the recent constitutional changes, which are occurring right now, let us question whether Kyrgyzstan will remain a democratic country. Maybe Armenia, but also here the consequences of the war in Nagorno-Karabakh will make a lot of questions regarding the domestic politics. And all other states, most importantly Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, the majority of Central Asian states are stable authoritarian countries. And these authoritarian countries engage in a complex web of interactions and form of cooperation. And most importantly, Eurasia is the part of the world where creation of formal alliances between authoritarian countries is the most prominent one. This is the phenomenon which is very often referred to as Eurasian regionalism. So, a very brief primer of what constitutes the Eurasian regionalism and how it worked, because it will matter a lot for our discussion. After the Soviet Union collapses, actually even before the Soviet Union collapses, before the Soviet Union is officially disbanded and ceases to exist, former Soviet Union republics established the Commonwealth of Independent States. At that moment of time, it is not yet a form of authoritarian regionalism because many of the post-Soviet countries are at least on their way to democracy or aspire to become democratic states. These hopes will not materialize for many of those, but still. But over time, as I said, most of them became authoritarian. The Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, proclaims very high hopes, very broad economic and political cooperation agenda. At the very beginning, it is not clear whether it will be a purely international organization, some sort of confederacy, whether there will be cooperation in military aspects, joint military forces, joint control over the nuclear forces, and so on. But over time, the CIS starts to come apart. The economic cooperation initiatives created in the CIS don't function. Countries immediately renege on their obligations, sometimes earlier almost immediately after the agreements were signed. And already by 1992, 1993, most latest 1994, it is clear that the CIS will not become a functioning international organization and able to promote economic cooperation. People systematically talk about ink on paper cooperation. I'll talk more about this in a minute. After the cooperation within the CIS clearly becomes unfeasible, the post-Soviet countries don't abandon the idea of cooperation, but rather proceed in smaller groups. And specifically, there are three of these smaller groups. One of them were attempts at cooperation and integration in Central Asia. They started with the so-called Central Asian Union, which incorporated all 5 Central Asian countries, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. But after a series of iteration and transformations, this cooperation didn't hold, and now there is no formal regional economic organization encompassing Central Asian countries. There are some initiatives, but they're financed by external donors, like the CAREC, which is financed by the Asian Development Bank. Another nucleus which emerges in the late 1990s is the Guam. Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Moldova. For a short time, it is Guam, because Uzbekistan also participates in it. And this is a very loose alliance, which doesn't even proclaim the idea of massive economic cooperation. And over time, it seems to be bound more and more by one issue, by concerns about growing Russian influence, and specifically about domestic frozen conflicts, the so-called frozen conflicts. This whole denomination is very disputable, but let's remain it like this. And Guam does not really achieve any substantial progress in terms of actual economic cooperation. And then there is a third group of projects which are all tied around Russia and mostly involve Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. These are 3 countries which are always there, with the addition of 3 other countries which are sometimes there and sometimes not: Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And this countries group is precisely what is especially important for us if we want to study authoritarian cooperation, because Belarus, since President Lukashenko comes to power, becomes an autocracy. Kazakhstan is autocracy from the very beginning under Nursultan Nazarbayev, and Russia, as I said, at least since 2000 under Putin, is an authoritarian state. So here we have some sort of example of international cooperation of authoritarian countries, and of 3 other smaller states. One, Tajikistan, is clearly an autocracy. Armenia balances around becoming an authoritarian regime. After the recent changes, one could probably see it as more democratic, and the same is true for Kyrgyzstan, where the situation remains unstable. So this is the case where key, most powerful actors are authoritarian. And since 1995, we observe a sequence of different integration initiatives which are created by these countries. It all starts with the customs union created by Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which later Kyrgyzstan joins. And this customs union is created in 1995, and it actually does achieve certain results. At some point of time, for example, the border controls are abolished by the countries, but it all collapses in 1998 with the economic crisis, with the global economic crisis, which forces Russia, Kazakhstan, and later Belarus to reintroduce protectionist measures. Then in 2000, the same countries plus Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan create the Eurasian Economic Community with ultimately the same objectives, which achieves very little progress. And in 2010, 3 countries again, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, create again a customs union. I mean, the confusing thing about Eurasia is that the same names are used over and over again. So there were at least 2 customs unions of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And this second customs union, the so-called Troika customs union, is a fundamental break from the old patterns of regionalism in Eurasia. While the previous organizations didn't produce any substantial economic cooperation results, this new customs union is actually a functioning one. This new customs union is an organization where countries really manage to work together and abolish the borders for internal trade. Then it is transformed into the common economic space, where also freedoms for the movement of capital and labor are established. And since 2015, we have the Eurasian Economic Union, an organization which is very much debated, to which also Kyrgyzstan and Armenia joined. And there is a discussion about joining the Eurasian Economic Union by Tajikistan and today even by Uzbekistan. And to understand the Eurasian Economic Union, the issue of authoritarian cooperation is highly important. And on top of that, Russia is an important, what Knoyer and Demmelhuber call authoritarian gravity center. It is an authoritarian country which is strongly engaged in international politics and in some sense serves as a protector and as an example for other authoritarian states. And another major authoritarian country, Kazakhstan, is at least sometimes discussed as a potential authoritarian gravity center, at least in Central Asia. So, post-Soviet Eurasia, as you see, is a part of the world where they have major, powerful international actor, which is authoritarian, Russia. And we have a lot of examples of multilateral and bilateral cooperations between authoritarian states, especially within the framework of what they have described as Eurasian regionalism. And this allows us to think about both questions I have posited now. The first one, the question about how authoritarian cooperation works in terms of substantive policies. And another one is how authoritarian cooperation works in terms of autocracy promotion. In both cases, I will rely on my own previous work, however, with different co-authors. The discussion of substantive policies relates very much on my work with Evgeny Vinokurov, and our paper, which we published in Post-Communist Economies, and my work and my presentation on authoritarian autocracy promotion relies on joint work with Anastasia Obudenkova and our book published with Oxford University Press. All right, so let's start with substantive policies. Again, the question is, do authoritarian countries manage to actually cooperate if we talk about practical policy issues like economic policies, like liberalizing foreign trade, like opening borders for migration or for capital movements? And the answer, which the literature almost unisono gives us, and which actually kind of fits the experience of the post-Soviet countries, is unlikely. Authoritarian regimes are much worse than democracies in cooperating with each other. It is not a coincidence that the European Union achieved much bigger progress of regional cooperation than the post-Soviet Eurasia, and that the key actors supporting liberal global order until recently were democratic countries, including the United States. Okay, Donald Trump presidency changed some things here, but still it remains to be seen whether it's a long-term change or just 4 years aberration. And authoritarian regimes are not so good at economic cooperation. Why not? Well, there are at least 3 reasons for that. One of them is the issue of credible commitments. In order to cooperate economically, countries have to promise to each other that they will stick to the rules which they establish. And what's particularly important, they will stick to the rules even in situations when it will be not so attractive for those. That means there is no risk that countries will exploit each other ex post after the agreement is signed. For example, in European Union, it will not happen that one country unilaterally ignores the commitments it makes within the European Union just because it favors it now. Because if other countries anticipate something like this happening, they will never enter cooperation in the first place. Democracies are not perfect at credible commitments, and the European Union is a best example of this. It goes way beyond my presentation to talk about that, but it's still, there is a lot of work on this. But at least they somehow manage credible commitments. And they manage it because their politicians are constrained by their voters and by domestic political institutions. They simply cannot change their foreign and their domestic policies so rapidly and with so little concern to their previous commitments as autocracies can. Autocracies are very good at ignoring their previous commitments simply because their leaders, their presidents are not punished by their voters for ignoring their previous commitments, and checks and balances are too weak to actually protect commitments. To give you an example, at some point of time, Vladimir Putin visited North Korea. And he had a meeting with the president of North Korea, and then he went back to Russia, and Putin said, Chairman Kim has promised me that he is going to abandon the program of developing of nuclear weapons. He told me that. And what really happened? Well, North Korean reaction was, President Kim made a joke. It was a funny joke, and Mr. Putin simply has poor sense of humor. He didn't understand that it was a joke. Now, if you think about that, jokes like this are extremely unlikely in the mouth of Macron or of Angela Merkel, for a very good reason. If they do a joke like this, domestic media and domestic public will not like it and will almost immediately punish those. And more importantly, they cannot decide everything on their own. They make some decisions, but many decisions are made by parliaments, by domestic political institutions, and no single politician can unilaterally make promises and then abstain from those. In autocracies, it's possible. And because of that, credible commitments are much weaker in authoritarian regimes, and this almost inevitably leads to much lower intensity of cooperation. On top of that, not only cannot authoritarian regimes promise to behave in the long run, but they very often don't want to. For autocratic leaders, any form of delegation of power can be seen as a sign of weakness. And because of that, delegating power to an international organization, to a supranational body, where other countries will determine, possibly will have a strong say, is simply not an option for authoritarian states. And this cooperation as a sign of weakness is a very serious challenge for autocracies, and because of that, many of them don't even want to start cooperation in the first place. And finally, economic protectionism is very beneficial for interest groups. And these interest groups will always have a say in autocracies because of the intransparent political decision-making and personalistic nature of politics. In Russia, for example, there are major interest groups which strongly encourage Russian leadership to pursue the protectionist course even more strongly than it does today. Russian textiles associations are always the biggest promoters of more and more protectionism. And from this point of view, in parts of the world where autocracies become predominant, we should observe much less international cooperation. And Eurasia until 2010 seems to fit this assumption. Of course, it's not only autocracy. The fact that Eurasian countries entered the nation-building period in the early 1990s, divergence of projects of economic reforms also played an important role. But over time, authoritarianism seems to matter more and more. Authoritarian regimes have limited trust towards each other, they frequently violate commitments they make, and this almost inevitably leads to lower level of cooperation. Vladimir Yevstigniev even shows that rhetoric of integration in Eurasia was very often used to hide protectionism. And from this, so actually people talked about Eurasian regionalism, Eurasian integration, just to promote economic liberalization, which would open the countries to foreign competitors from outside Eurasia. So you say, well, we're not going to liberalize globally, we're going to pursue post-Soviet integration, and then you don't even pursue post-Soviet integration. So Eurasian countries didn't achieve a lot in terms of regionalism. They made great promises. They all the time committed to advancing regional integration, and then nothing happened. This was always called ink on paper integration. And from this point of view, if I were giving this talk in 2009, and actually in 2009 I published a paper which somewhat ironically appeared only in 2011 in print, where I actually claim that this authoritarian nature of post-Soviet countries will systematically preclude them from successfully cooperating. And here comes a problem, and the problem is the puzzle of the Eurasian Economic Union. Because as I told you just now, Eurasian Economic Union, unlike its predecessors, is actually a functioning regional organization. And then the question emerges why it is the case. All right, There is this old saying attributed to Einstein, although Einstein probably didn't say it. What madness or paranoia is. Madness is repeating the same thing over and over again and then hoping for a different result. And Eurasian regionalism kind of looks like this madness, or looked like this madness until 2010. So both Soviet countries meet, very often the same presidents meet, because they stay in power for many, many years, in the same groups, in the same capital cities, in the same form, and then sign agreements with the same content, and these agreements are not implemented. So first you sign the CIS agreement, then you sign the economic union of the CIS agreement, then you sign the free trade area of the CIS agreement, then you sign the customs union agreement, then you sign the Eurasian Economic Community agreement. In the middle you sign the Commonwealth of Russia and Belarus agreement, Union State of Russia and Belarus agreement, dozens and dozens of these agreements, and then nothing works, nothing works, nothing works, and all of them promise the same results. But the strange thing about Eurasian regionalism is that at some point of time this madness stopped. And repeating the same over and over again produced an actual result, and the result was the customs union of 2010. When the same three presidents who already tried so many integration initiatives, Putin, Lukashenko, and Nazarbayev, managed to create a functioning regional cooperation organization. Okay, my time in this class is limited, and I'm not going to give you a detailed introduction to the Eurasian Economic Union. Yevgeny Vinokurov published a very nice book called Introduction to the Eurasian Economic Union with Palgrave Macmillan. If you're interested in this topic, you can read it. But just very briefly, Eurasian Economic Union is of course not an analog to the EU. And those who say, well, Eurasian Economic Union is incomparable with the EU, that's just true, and there is nothing more to discuss about this. At the same time, unlike its predecessors, Eurasian Economic Union is a functioning organization. It is an organization which, first of all, includes some level of a customs union, meaning a structure where countries use harmonized external foreign trade tariffs and abandon internal trade tariffs. EIU customs union functions with substantial exceptions, especially after Kazakhstan joined the European Union, joined the WTO, World Trade Organization. But we have to be aware of the fact that there are very, very few actual customs unions in the world. Most international regional organizations achieve at best the level of a free trade area. They abandon some of the customs duties for internal trade, but don't harmonize external customs duties. Eurasian Economic Union actually managed to harmonize the external customs duties. And from this point of view, Eurasian Economic Union is of course not a perfect success, but it achieved way more than many other organizations. In the Eurasian Economic Union, there is freedom of movement of people and of capital, and there are some common policies, and there is an ambitious agenda of further integration, which is, with many loopholes, slowly but still implemented. For example, cooperation in the energy markets or cooperation in the area of common market for medical products. So Eurasian Economic Union is clearly not a perfect case of regionalism, but which organization is. However, it is not a case of pure rhetoric. And then we have a question: why did the same countries which signed similar agreements for 2 decades and almost produced only rhetorical ink on paper cooperation, all of a sudden produced functioning regionalism? It is particularly paradoxical because at the moment when Eurasian Economic Union and the Customs Union of 2010 was established, economic ties between countries were much less intensive than in the previous eras. Trade between Russia and Kazakhstan systematically declined over the 20 years of Kazakhstani independence. And even Belarus is now less dependent from Russia than it was in 1991 or 1995. The fundamental wisdom we have from the theory of regional economic integration is that the more intensive economic ties are, the higher are the chances for integration to succeed. It kind of makes sense because intensive economic ties guarantee that countries benefit from regionalism, right? If you don't trade with each other, then it should be much more difficult for you to create a regional organization. There is smaller incentive to do so. But if you engaged in very intensive trade, then benefits are very substantial. And then we have a big question. Why did authoritarian regimes in Eurasia progress towards functioning regionalism precisely at the moment when the economic ties between those were actually smaller, and therefore the benefits from economic cooperation were smaller? So we discussed this issue in our paper with Evgeny Vinokurov, published as mentioned in 2018, and the argument we make there is a bit paradoxical. What we claim is that somewhat unexpectedly, unlike democracies, autocracies seem to be more likely to cooperate if they are less integrated economically. And the reason is precisely the factor which I have already mentioned a couple of times, specifically this issue of credible commitments. We talked about that, and we said that the key concern for authoritarian countries is that they are afraid that their partners will violate commitments and exploit them. And in the situation of very intensive economic ties, the costs of these exploitations are enormous. And that's why if you're already economically very dependent on your partner, entering a functioning regional cooperation agreement, which will only cement this dependence or even increase it, is clearly suboptimal. And because of that, in the 1990s or in the 2000s especially, entering economic cooperations with Russia, with which you anyway have very intensive cooperation, pragmatically, I mean trade, capital flows, and so on, is not what authoritarian countries want, because they feel it makes them even more dependent. In 2010, however, and that's the paradoxical part of the story, economic intense ties between Russia and Kazakhstan were much less intensive, and precisely because of this, Kazakhstan was less concerned and less afraid of entering cooperation with Russia. And this is the reason why Eurasian Economic Union came to be. It's also the reason why there are clear limits for cooperation in the Eurasian Economic Union, and these limits clearly proceed from the fact that Eurasian Economic Union is an organization where some sorts of more advanced cooperation will inevitably again trigger fears of the members of excessive dependence, so that only cooperation within certain boundaries is actually feasible in this organization. So, authoritarian cooperation is actually possible, but somewhat paradoxically only under conditions that authoritarian countries are not that dependent on each other. So if you want, paradoxically, they cooperate precisely in the situations when this cooperation is not so beneficial. All right. Now let me proceed to the second perspective, which I guess is also more interesting for us, the perspective on autocracy cooperation and autocracy promotion. And the question here is actually, well, in the previous part of my class, I kind of rejected this pseudo-cooperation of the 1990s and of the 2000s. I called it ink-on-paper cooperation. I said it doesn't matter at all, but maybe this imitation of regionalism also served a purpose. Because otherwise, why do countries engage in it? The idea is that possibly this purpose was that this so-called economic cooperation, prior to the Eurasian Economic Union, was created not to cooperate economically, but to achieve a very different objective, the objective what we can call autocracy promotion and protective integration. So the idea is very simple. Democratic countries, not all of them, but at least the European Union and the United States, are systematically engaged in promoting democracy abroad. They are openly committing to supporting democratization and democratic transition abroad. And on top of that, interaction with these countries also creates some sort of diffusion effects. So countries which are systematically interacting with the European Union are likely to experience democratic transformation themselves. This is the issue of the so-called leverages and linkages effects. The issue of democracy promotion became a very, very big topic for academic research, and European Union is actually an example how this democracy promotion works. Because stabilization of democracy in most Eastern European countries happened, in Central Eastern European countries, happened not without the help of the European Union. I mean, the current democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary also, of course, shows the limits to this, but nevertheless, external issue of democracy promotion is a very big one. Starting from mid-2000s, researchers have more and more often asked the question whether authoritarian regimes do the same. Authoritarian regimes support autocracies. That's actually not a new phenomenon. Soviet Union supported similar socialist authoritarian regimes, the people's democracy countries in Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, in Cuba, and worldwide. So the fact that autocracy supports similar regimes is nothing new, but the question is whether it's happening today. And possibly, if autocracies are successful, their success triggers adaptation of similar strategies worldwide. For example, Chinese economic success could trigger emulation of Chinese political model, the so-called Beijing consensus. It actually doesn't happen because Chinese political thought is very much based on the idea of Chinese exceptionality, but that's a different story. At the very least, autocracies can work together to prevent a democratic diffusion. And precisely for Eurasia, where European Union is just across the corner and where the influence of European Union economically and politically is quite substantial, for autocracies working together to prevent democratization effects of the European Union, the spillover effects could be an attractive strategy. And indeed, there are many things which countries can do to support autocracy among each other. There is a direct military support. In Eurasia, it plays a very small role. But, for example, when Putin kind of announced that based on agreement with Lukashenko, he formed what he called a reserve of Belarusian law enforcement forces in Russia to aid Lukashenko to deal with protests which erupted in 2020, it almost sounded like a risk of military intervention. It didn't happen, of course. It happens in other parts of the world. For example, during Arab Spring, the revolution of Bahrain was suppressed with direct military support of Saudi Arabian forces. What is more important in Eurasia is cooperation of security services, exchange of information about possible dissidents, arrests of dissidents, which are then delivered to other countries. Economic assistance. You can give money to your fellow autocrats so that they can distribute those among their supporters and survive in difficult times. But finally, and this is exactly the point where purely rhetorical regionalism plays a very big role, the important issue is the ideational support. This ideational support concerns mutual learning. Autocracies meet, exchange ideas, learn from each other what the best way of suppressing democracy is, and legitimacy. Legitimacy provision plays a very important role because autocracies can actually help other autocracies here in many ways. First, they can provide some sort of respect. So if an authoritarian leader is participating in summits with other authoritarian leaders, if other authoritarian leaders openly declare support to autocracy abroad, for example, Putin openly supports Lukashenko, in Latin America, Chavez expressed support to, or Maduro expressed support towards Putin. This respect kind of convinces both the public of authoritarian states, but also their elites that they are not isolated from the international community, that they enjoy high status, recognition, and support, and from this point of view, there's nothing wrong with those. And this increases their legitimacy. And furthermore, the endorsement of political practices can be done. For example, falsified elections. If Russia looks at falsified elections in Ukraine or in under Yanukovych or in Belarus and says that's just perfect elections, that's exactly how you should do it, that's rhetorical support they offer to their partners. And from this point of view, rhetorical regionalism, a framework within which you can exercise this support, is actually very important. The very fact that authoritarian president is invited to a summit of an authoritarian regional organization could matter very much in this context. And if we look at Eurasia, we see quite a few examples of this autocracy promotion, or at least cooperation of authoritarian regimes. Economic assistance plays a very important role. We know that Russia provides major economic benefits to Belarus. Actually, Russian subsidies systematically are in the 2-digit % level of the Belarusian GDP. But also for other authoritarian countries in Eurasia, in some cases, Russia is an important partner. For example, for Tajikistan, economic stability of this country very much relies on Russia opening its borders to Tajikistani migrants. And this is kind of controversial things which autocrats can do, because Russia at the same time engages in, Russian politicians at the same time occasionally endorse xenophobic rhetoric, very much directed against labor migrants from Central Asia, but also keep Russian borders open for these migrants to cooperate with authoritarian regimes in these states. Exchange of information across security services, there is some indirect evidence on that, but it's flourishing in Eurasia. Not only with Russia and other smaller countries, but also with Russia and China, for example, which seem to actively learn from each other how to govern internet and how to use different technologies of digital monitoring and suppression. And finally, rhetoric is very important. To provide you just one example, Commonwealth of Independent States has an Institute of Election Monitoring. So observers from the CIS travel all over the post-Soviet Eurasia, come to different countries, and monitor elections there. And it is almost a systematic rule. No matter what happens in these elections, observers of the CIS are extremely happy with those. And actually, typically, they're more happy with those if they are particularly illegitimate and problematic. So CIS electoral monitoring is always endorsing authoritarian election manipulation. And the cases when CIS becomes more concerned about election manipulations are sometimes elections which are actually, by other observers, like the OSCE, proclaimed as free and fair. So CIS is kind of an organization which always sends observers which will endorse precisely what authoritarian leaders want, endorse authoritarian elections. And another example is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with the three evils. Rhetoric taken over from China, separatism, extremism, and terrorism, which is very actively used to combat domestic opposition, which you can then frame within this language, and for which you can immediately rhetorical support of other influential international countries. So the fact that Eurasian countries at least engage in activities which look like autocracy promotion is documented by multiple studies. And yet autocracy promotion is, in spite of meanwhile rather substantial research on this topic, an issue which causes a lot of questions. The first obvious one, why do autocracies promote autocracy? The literature is sometimes kind of playing out the Hollywood movie. So Putin is a bad guy, he likes other bad guys, and that's why he supports these bad guys. But is it really the case that the explanation is so simple? Is it, by the way, the case that democracies always support democracy? Today, European Union is committed to democracy promotion, but even European Union sometimes prioritizes stability over democracy. And if we look at the United States and its history, United States has quite frequently supported, and actually even today occasionally supports, quite openly authoritarian regimes. But anyway, why should autocracies support autocracy? Ideology, like in the Soviet Union, which promoted similar communist, socialist regimes, that's not an issue in Eurasia. Eurasian authoritarian regimes are not ideological. So there are several explanations for this. One of them is that this support is purely unintentional. So authoritarian regimes talk with each other, they learn from each other, and this learning constitutes support, and this support is very important, but not that authoritarian regimes really plan to support each other. Okay, but these unintended learning effects are actually not what authoritarian regimes really wanted to do, wanted to achieve. And we see also in Eurasia many cases of quite intentional autocracy promotion. Why does this happen? One explanation is authoritarian regimes promote autocracy to prevent spillover effects. So for Russia, it's not that they want Belarus to be authoritarian, but Russia is concerned that if a democratic revolution happens in Belarus, like it happened in Ukraine, it could create spillovers for Russia. It could create learning effects among the Russian opposition, among the Russian public. And the best way to convince the Russian public that autocracy in Russia is unchallengeable is to show that it is not challenged in similar regimes in other countries of post-Soviet Eurasia. Then, of course, we have the question, all right, if this is the case, then Is it really so that promoting autocracy is the best way to contain spillovers? Because maybe there are other tools. For example, for Russia, it may be more attractive not to show a robust authoritarian regime in the neighboring states, but rather show that they slide into chaos, the permanent conflicts, and so on. And this is maybe even more threatening for domestic power. Or something else. So there's a question about this. But still, containing spillovers can be a reason for autocracy promotion. Or it may be mutual rent-seeking. Maybe Russia or other authoritarian countries are searching for partners with whom they can engage in rent-seeking together. And authoritarian regimes are better for this. But then the question emerges, is it the case that autocracies always promote autocracy? For example, in Kyrgyzstan, Russia quite systematically endorsed democratic revolutions and actually had problems with more authoritarian presidents like Kurmanbek Bakiyev. And why is that? Another example, in Ukraine, Russia, while generally supporting President Yanukovych, did not at all encourage his decision to arrest Yulia Tymoshenko, at that moment of time an important opposition leader. And actually, Russia used exactly the same rhetoric in this case than the one used by the European Union in democratic countries. Another example, European Union and Russia actually cooperated in dealing with the rule of oligarch Plahotniuk in Moldova in finding a better accommodation solution for this country. And then the question is, why does Russia in some cases really viciously support authoritarian regimes like Lukashenko in Belarus, who really gets pardoned for almost everything he does, including arresting Russian businessmen and systematically reneging on promises he made to Russia. And in other cases, Russia is so much focused on, Russia really doesn't care. And the question is, maybe it's not about autocracy promotion, maybe it's not about similarity of regimes, maybe it's simply about geopolitical influence. If Russia sees that supporting certain politician makes it more powerful, it supports this politician. If it sees that it doesn't make it more powerful, it simply ignores him or her. Or maybe it's about economic interests. Does any form of authoritarian cooperation promote autocracy? Another big question. For example, Eurasian Economic Union. Is it really an institution which supports authoritarian regimes? If you look at both rhetoric and practices of Eurasian Economic Union, it really massively focuses only on economic issues. It, unlike the CIS, refuses any form of discussion about politics. There are no election observers from the Eurasian Economic Union. Does it mean that the Eurasian Economic Union is not a matter for autocracy promotion at all? There is a paper of mine which I've written with Anastasia Bedenkova and published in International Affairs, and there we show that Eurasian Economic Union as such is not a tool of autocracy promotion. But what happens there is that Russia is really interested in some groups of countries joining the EIU, and it looks like at least some parts of the world, like the post-Soviet Eastern Europe, autocracies are more likely to do so than democracies. And that's why it is through bilateral relations promoting the authoritarian regimes in these countries, but the Eurasian Economic Union as such is regime neutral. And then the big question, does autocracy promotion matter at all? Is Belarusian authoritarian regime product of Russian influence or its domestic factors? And actually the consensus today is while Russia or other external partners can play a role in autocracy promotion, ultimately it's a domestic phenomenon that you have consolidation of authoritarian regimes. So external factors, both democratic and authoritarian, while not entirely irrelevant, should not be overestimated. And finally, the last point, do only big and strong countries promote autocracy? Because in many cases in Eurasia, we've seen Russia being more passive than small authoritarian states like Kazakhstan or like Belarus, which really take the lead. And what we see here maybe is not autocracy promotion, Russia actively defending other autocracies, but rather some sort of coalition of authoritarian regimes with authoritarian countries working together, but where smaller states have an equally active position than the big one. Or maybe it's about subnational level and about where Russian regions are sometimes learning authoritarian practices from post-Soviet countries. So it's not like, Russia is the big bad wolf. it may be a much more complex phenomenon. And then finally, this is the last thing I want to discuss in our class, the big question of autocracy promotion literature are normative implications. So for example, we observe autocracy promotion in Eurasia. What does it mean for the European Union? Should the European Union try to counteract this autocracy promotion, and how? One could claim one should undermine it, and indeed there would be those in European and American elites who would very much encourage this point of view. You have these discussions about actively stopping Russian influence in Eurasia. When the Eurasian Union was in discussion, the then Secretary of State of the United States, Hillary Clinton, made a very famous statement, make no mistake about the Eurasian regionalism. It's just a revival of the Soviet Union. We will not support it in any way. But then the question is it consistent with supporting pluralism and liberalism abroad? Meaning that maybe we mix up it with foreign policy and with geopolitical concerns. Or maybe we don't really act against illiberal authoritarian practices, but rather against projects and initiatives which we don't like. For example, there is a lot of skepticism in the EU about the Eurasian Economic Union, but is it because the Eurasian Economic Union is such a big, bad authoritarian project, or because European Union's bureaucracy has its own idea how regionalism in Eurasia should look like, the projects of Eastern Partnership, of the European Neighborhood Policy, and they just don't want to bother to think about how to fix these projects with the ideas of the Eurasian Economic Union. It's just easier to reject it altogether. Maybe what we see in Eurasia is not necessarily something that we should unilaterally reject. How does undermining autocracy promotion square with international norms? And can democracies do it at all? Are they effective at it? Another solution is to tolerate autocracy promotion, assuming ultimately higher attractiveness of democracies. But is it really the case? Can democracy promotion function if you have active authoritarian players in the region? And final question is, what should we do if autocracy promotion happens within institutions which at the same time claim normal economic goals like promoting international trade liberalization? So here I'm kind of combining both parts of my discussion, autocracy promotion, substantive policies cooperation. For example, look at the Eurasian Economic Union. Eurasian Economic Union is an organization promoting economic cooperation and trade, but at the same time, Eurasian Economic Union, of course, is an institution which is important for Russian foreign policy. And as I just said, is at least the reason why Russia engages in autocracy promotion. So, if we now label Eurasian Economic Union or Shanghai Cooperation Organization or CIS bad autocracy promoting organization and don't work with them, how does it correspond to the fact that we actually want regional cooperation promoting trade and development? And if we work with these organizations as if they were just normal organizations promoting trade and development, how does it match the fact that these organizations are actually engaged in, or at least linked to, like the Eurasian Economic Union, to autocracy promotion? What do we do with this? How do we work with these contradictions? I'm not going to give you an answer to that. Next semester I'm actually teaching a class on autocracy promotion, and maybe some of you will join me and we will have a chance to discuss it at length. And I really hope towards the end of the semester, maybe even not only online. I registered the class as a offline class, but let's see whether it will happen or not. Now let me just conclude my main remarks, and then we will finish this conversation. So Eurasia is an excellent example for diverse and complex forms of cooperation of authoritarian regimes, but it also shows that this cooperation has limits. Eurasia calls our attention to the non-traditional gains of regime cooperation like autocracy promotion. It confirms that authoritarian actors remain important players in international relations, even global ones. And sometimes, that's the most interesting thing, sometimes authoritarian regimes actually benefit from the existence of globalization and economic openness. For example, there's an excellent book by Cooley and Alexander Cooley, which shows that in Central Asia, regimes are successful precisely because of their involvement in the complex web of international economic relations, which allows them to gain grants. And Russian regime is also very clever at gaining from international economic cooperation and from trade and from economic globalization. I don't have a good answers for these questions, how to deal with these problems. But I can only say that international cooperation with authoritarian regimes poses important policy challenges for which we don't really have a good answer. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing these slides and this recording with you.